listening to God's story. It is the 29th time that we have gathered together for this purpose. What we are trying to achieve is to read through the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation, 3 chapters apiece, and ask the question of the meaning of the message contained in each 3-chapter segment. So today we will be reading from the book of Exodus, and the chapters for study is 31, 32, and 33. My sermon's title is God's Story, the Golden Calf. The Golden Calf. And it begins in Exodus chapter 32. Let's read first 4 verses. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hands and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." So they made a calf. As the children's story pointed out, it's a small cow. Now, why not an elephant? Why not make an elephant or a giraffe or a crocodile or maybe some other animal to worship? Why specifically a calf? Here's the answer. The book of Acts, chapter 7, verses 39 through 41. It says, "Our fathers refused to obey him, but thrust him aside, and in their hearts they turned to Egypt, saying to Aaron, 'Make for us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses who led us out from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him.' And they made a calf in those days and offered a sacrifice to the idol and were rejoicing in the works of their hands." So, did you catch it? Where did the idea come from? From Egypt. If you could show us verse number 39 again, it says that they turned their hearts to Egypt. They lived there for quite some time, and they have grown used to and accustomed to the customs of pagans around, Egyptians in that case, who worshipped bulls. May we take a look at the picture? It's a picture taken it's brought to us from Egypt. It's a depiction of a bull on a sarcophagus, on one of the sarcophaguses discovered in Egypt. And this bull is named Apis. Apis is a name of an Egyptian deity who was thought to be an embodiment, a bodily form of the soul of Egyptian god Osiris. So this sun god supposedly dwelt within this sacred calf, sacred bull. And the round disc that you see between its horns represents the sun disc. So it's one of the gods, the sun gods, that was worshipped in Egypt. And it was pretty much spread all over the regions of the Nile in Egypt, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. So, after spending there in the land of Egypt quite some time, the people of Israel turned to what was familiar, what they have used to. And that's why they say, make us gods. And Aaron made specifically a calf. So, what we have here is a pagan style and elements of worship. But the peculiar thing is this. Let's read from the book of Exodus, chapter 32, verse 5. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to... And then what would you expect as a continuation? To the calf, to the bull, to Apis, to Osiris, right? Because that's what they made. But no, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And the word Lord, of course, is a translation of the Hebrew term for the true God. In the original, it is Chag LaYehovah. Chag is a feast, and then Yehovah, of course, is Jehovah, or the name of God, which is typically sounded out as Lord in most of the English translations. So here's the thing: it was a feast to the Lord, to the true God, with elements of paganism. And this is a situation that's called in the special literature by the term of syncretism. And syncretism, according to Merriam-Webster dictionary, is the combination, the fusion of two or more originally different forms of belief or practice. Something that's not congruent, that's not harmonizable in its nature, but just put together. Syncretism is a form of beliefs and religious practice that combines something from God's story, something from God's commandments, and a pagan, heathen elements and practices of worshiping their gods. So when we're trying to understand the nature of what was happening there at the bottom of Mount Sinai, first of all, we discover that it was Egyptian style of worship. But to the Israelites who did that, who engaged in that, it was not an apostasy. They did not stop believing in the God who created heaven and earth. They thought that they were continuing to worship the same God, but with elements that were from a foreign origin. Now, when we go on reading, we can take a look at some of the elements of that worship. The book of Exodus, chapter 32, verse 6 says, And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. A number of elements are mentioned here. First of all, sacrifices, burnt offerings and peace offerings. These are godly forms of worship, aren't they? This is something, burnt offerings and peace offerings are prescribed, are commanded to be offered by the Torah, by the Bible. So this is all kosher so far, right? Burnt offerings, peace offerings. What's the next element? It's up in this on the screen there. It says that they, Exodus 32, verse 6, and the people sat down to eat and drink. Is it an acceptable form of worship according to God's commandments? Let's remind ourselves the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 27:7, and you shall sacrifice peace offerings and shall eat there, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God. So it is also commanded to have a meal as part of congregational worship, communal worship, is God's commandment. So when they sat to eat and drink, no problem there. What's the next element? Again, verse number 6, the book of Exodus chapter 32 says, and they rose up to do what? Do you see it? They rose up to play. When I was a child, I was always curious, what kind of games did they play? And what was so bad about those games, right? They rose up to play. What were they doing, actually? Well, we have the original text to help us. But before that, here's how New International Version puts it. Got up to indulge in revelry. I have a hard time pronouncing this, so let me try it again. Revelry. So this is some kind of a behavior that's not acceptable. So these games, these plays that they did, they were something very bad, supposedly, right? So what exactly? We find that the original has the verb tzahak in Hebrew, and in the stem that it is used, in the form that it is used, which is PL, these are two examples for us to consider. The book of Genesis, chapter 26, verses 7 through 9. When the man of the place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister." For he feared to say, "My wife," thinking lest the man of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. Laughing, in this case, is the translation. It's an attempt to translate the word tzahak, right? So, after he saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife, he called Isaac and said, "Behold, she is your wife." "How then could you say she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I thought lest I die because of her." What were they doing together, Isaac and his wife? That when looking at them, Abimelech knew that they were a married couple. So when you question the choice of laughing as a translation, you immediately see that English Standard Version that I'm using for this sermon has a footnote and says that Hebrew may suggest an intimate relationship. And this is exactly what is happening. They really thought that Isaac and Rebekah were brother and sister, but when they saw engaging in tzahak, Abimelech immediately knew that they are husband and wife. So this verb describes something that husbands and wives do. Another passage. The book of Genesis, chapter 39, verses 11 through 15. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us." The same verb, tzahak. "He came in to me to do what?" This version, to lie with me. And I cried out with a loud voice, and as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. What was the Potiphar's wife accusing Joseph of? He supposedly, according to her statement, was trying to be intimate with her. That's the meaning of the verb tzahak. So let us go back. Exodus chapter 32, verse 6 says, "And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." So what was happening there was acts of intimacy happening all over the place as part of serving this god Apis, the Egyptian god. And when you go down in the story, the book of Exodus chapter 32 verse 25 says, "And when Moses saw that the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose, to the derision of their enemies." Again, to break loose is an attempt to translate the Hebrew verb farah. Here's the literal translation. King James Version has it literally. It says, Moses saw that the people were naked. This was another element of their worship. And if it sounds strange to you, just know that the people of the land of Canaan regularly, routinely practiced these acts as a service, as a way to serve their gods of fertility, because they thought that the more intimate acts are performed in public, the more fertile the land will be, the more fertile their animals will be, and so forth. So this is what Moses saw. He saw the naked people, and he saw these lewd public acts. Now, when we go on to see what they were actually doing, we find verses 18 and 19, same chapter, Exodus 32. Exodus 32, verses 18 and 19. "But he said, it is not the sound of shouting for victory or the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear. And as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain." Two more elements. What are they? Singing and also dancing. Singing and dancing. And these are words ana and meholah in the original, in Hebrew. My question to you, is this an acceptable form of worshiping God, the true God? Singing? Dancing? Let's briefly read from prior experience of God's people in the book of Exodus chapter 15, verses 20 and 21. "Then Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sang to them, saying to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." So both of these words, specifically Anna and Meholah, are used here as a description of how the Israelites worshipped and praised God after he saved them from the Pharaoh and his army. And after they crossed the sea, they praised God. And they did what? They sang and they danced. So this was a part of expressing worship to God. I just need to point out that the word meholah means dancing in a circle. So you might have caught that women were dancing together, and then in other places of the Bible it says that men would dance also separately, also in circles. So circle dance, a mehala, that's what it is. So per se, singing and dancing was used in the context of worshiping the true God. But we could be absolutely sure that these songs and these dances, they were lewd in nature, because it was part of this outburst of immorality, of public display of uncleanness. So there are songs that actually make a person prone to be engaged in immoral activities. Music has power over people, and there are dances that are designed to hit up passions, to be overcome and to be inflamed with unholy, ungodly desires, sinful desires toward people who are not allowed to you by marriage and so forth. So these are the elements. We see some of them that are godly and go directly as God intended, burnt offerings, peace offerings, eating and drinking before the Lord, rejoicing, singing, going in round processions, round dancing, and so forth. Per se, they are godly, but some of the elements were borrowed from pagan practices, worshipping this image, adding this public demonstration of intimacy, nakedness, and so forth. These are the elements that were borrowed from elsewhere. Now, after establishing, at least briefly, what was taking place there, let's ask the Bible, what is God's take on this? What is God's evaluation of what was happening? What's God's view and what's God's message in relation to this story? The book of Exodus, chapter 32, verses 21, 30, and 31. And Moses said to Aaron, "What did these people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" What is the evaluation? What is the designation? Great sin. Now, verses 30 and 31. The next day Moses said to the people, "You have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." So Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold." So the overall evaluation, the overall view is pretty clear. It's a great sin. And really, oftentimes it's hard for people to understand. Yes, a couple of weeks did pass. But a couple of weeks before that, these people, they saw the Mount Sinai on flames, melting stone. They heard the loud noise. They saw fire. They heard God speaking. And God specifically mentioned, "This is what are my words. This is what you shall not do." And these are the consequences. So the people who just heard God's commandments a couple of weeks ago, how could they do these abominable things, thinking that they are still worshiping the same God? So it's a great sin. That's the overall characteristic. Now, some details. The book of Exodus, chapter 32, verses 7 and 8. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. Do you see how the language changes? Whose people are these? Whose people are they? It says, your people. God tells Moses, go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. Not my people anymore. Because the covenant is obviously broken. They have chosen a different God, right? So the first characteristic is they have corrupted themselves. And we have seen this word before when God was describing the state of human population before the flood. It says that the whole earth has corrupted itself. So in the original it is the verb shahat, which means to become ruined. When, let's say, a fruit is rotten, that's the verb to describe that. So they have been spoiled, they have been ruined. Then it says in verse 8, they turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded. So God next makes a reference to his commandments. So which ones exactly did they break in that case? The book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 4 and 5 say, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord, your God, and so forth. This is exactly what they did. They made an idol and they worshipped the idol. So what was then God's verdict towards them? Verse number 9 says, and the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and that I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. How would you translate, how would you phrase this word combination, a stiff-necked people? What does it convey? What does it mean? They are a stiff-necked people. They are hardened in their ways. When you have a stiff neck, it's not movable, it's not adjustable. You cannot do anything, you cannot change, you can only break, right? So these are the kinds of people that they were. And because their sin was willful, and because it was a course of action that they understood to be in opposition to God's will, the punishment was annihilation. It says, let my anger burn so that I may consume them, and I will make a different nation out of you, God says. So the verdict is that they are guilty of death. They should be punished because they know, and they still are stiff-necked. They do it willingly, and they do it being rebellious. And if God had done that, no one could blame him for being unjust. But here's what happened in reality. The book of Exodus, chapter 32, verse 20. He took the calf that they had made, and burned it with fire, and ground it to powder, and scattered it on the water, and made the people of Israel drink it. What is that about? Why did Moses do this? Do you remember a passage in the Bible that's similar to this, where dust would be mixed with water, and that someone would drink it for a specific purpose? It's the book of Numbers, chapter 5, verses 17, 27, and 28. And the priest shall take holy water in an earthenware made out of clay vessel, and take some of the dust that is on the floor of the tabernacle, and put it into the water. And when he has made her drink the water, then, if she has defiled herself and has broken faith with her husband, the water that brings the curse shall enter into her and cause bitter pain, and her womb shall swell, and her thigh shall fall away, and the woman shall become a curse among her people. But if the woman has not defiled herself and is clean, then she shall be free and shall conceive children. There was this interesting ritual that was used to determine whether there was marital unfaithfulness or not. When a person drinks this water mixed with dust, then if there is guilt, it will immediately show. If there is no guilt, then the person will stay alive and so forth. This is what was happening there after they worshipped the calf. It was a test designed for adulterous people, or those who are accused of adultery, to check and to test whether they have broken faith or not, whether they are faithful or not. So what is very important to understand is that whatever happened later, it was not done without consideration or study or testing. God first put all the people to the test to make sure to find those who are guilty. Then we go on reading the book of Exodus, chapter 32, verses 26 through 29. Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered around him. Another important part of this story. God gave people a chance to choose anew, to choose again. After going through this testing with water, Moses says, if you want to be on God's side, just come to me. So even though you have engaged in these lewd acts, even though you have engaged in this immoral behavior, I still give you a chance. This is another chance, a second act that allows people to come to their senses and say, yes, I do want to be with God. I do want to live according to His will. Then verses 33 through 35. But the Lord said to Moses, Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But now go, lead the people to the place about which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them. Then the Lord sent a plague on the people, because they made the calf, the one that Aaron made. So what we see here, that there were 3 chances given for people to stop their sin, to pause, to repent, to ask forgiveness, to return to the Lord. Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me, said Moses. So there were 3 episodes that allowed people to make a choice in God's favor and to repent. And therefore, this story in the Bible is mentioned a number of times as a story showing God's mercy. The book of Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 18 through 20. Even when they had made for themselves a golden calf and said, "This is your God who brought you up out of Egypt," and had committed great blasphemies, even though they did that, you, in your great mercies, did not forsake them in the wilderness. The pillar of cloud to lead them in the way did not depart from them by day, nor the pillar of fire by night, to light for them the way by which they should go. You gave your good spirit to instruct them, and did not withhold your manna from their mouth, and gave them water for their thirst. This story is a story about God's great mercy. Though they were worthy to die for their willful sins, God still gave them chance after chance, and He showed great mercy towards them. So today's sermon is God's story, colon, the golden calf. There are at least two very important lessons for us today. First one, using elements of paganism in serving God is categorically unacceptable. You could call it Christian. It might have been in Christianity for centuries. It doesn't matter. If it's not in the Word of God, if it's a violation of God's commandments, then it is not to be used. If it is pagan in origin, it could not be harmonized. It's a syncretism then, and it's a sin. So first, have you checked how you worship God for elements of paganism in what is customary to you personally or to the congregation that you attend and worship at or with? This is the first question to ask. Is your service to God free from the elements of paganism? And of course, the main one, even if a person sinned, even if we sinned, unknowingly or even willfully, but if we stop, if we reconsider, if we want to ask forgiveness and do ask forgiveness, if we want to leave the sin behind, God is always there to accept us. God is a God of great mercy. Amen.